In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Red Rogue build. This is an all-game build that can be used from pretty much the very beginning of the game using the Reduvia Dagger. I did extensive testing with this dagger during my daggers video, and I fell in love with this weapon. I'm also going to be doing another dagger build with the Glintstone Chris. I was kind of torn between these two weapons, so you can stay tuned for that build also pretty soon. So let's get into the Red Rogue and how this build plays. This is a very, very simple build. It was designed to be able to be played from the very beginning of the game. And it's a build that I think will perform pretty well in Shadow of the Erdtree because of how much bleed buildup it does per hit. And unless, the vast majority of enemies in the DLC area are bleed immune or very bleed resistant, I think you're going to have a pretty easy time with this build. So the general concept of this build is I simply have the Reduvia Dagger and I've pumped Arcane. I've met the base requirements for it. I've pumped Arcane to the moon here. Not only to boost the damage of this weapon and weapon skill, but also in order to increase the bleed buildup that Reduvia does, because we want to trigger hemorrhage very, very quickly. And even though you can increase dexterity and get more damage as well, you want to prioritize Arcane in order to get that bleed buildup on top of it. And if you want to use something like the Dragon Communion Seal with this weapon, which you could in your offhand, and maybe put a few points into Faith to cast some spells, you absolutely could do that as well. I have not done that here because I feel like it's unnecessary, but you can do that if you would rather have some spellcasting prowess. This would allow you to use things like Flame Grant Me Strength, which is particularly effective with this weapon because it deals 100% physical damage, and its projectile also does 100% physical damage. So you get a lot out of that. If you had 25 Faith, you could use Golden Vow, etc. And there, are a plethora of other spells you could use with very low Faith using the Dragon Communion Seal. I just simply didn't do that here because I didn't really need it. So what really makes this weapon sing, in my opinion, is the Reduvia Bloodblade weapon skill. This shoots out sort of a smallish blood wave that deals physical damage, as I just mentioned, in a medium short distance. It's not very long range, but it does do blood buildup or hemorrhage buildup with each hit. And since patch 1.07, it also connects with the blade if you're point blank. If you're in range to hit with the projectile and the blade, you'll hit with both, making it very, very deadly at point-blank range because you're not only getting the damage from the projectile and the weapon, you're also getting the bleed buildup of both. And this makes it so that you trigger hemorrhage very, very quickly, much, much faster than if you were playing with even two Reduvias in a New Game Plus or Reduvia and a Blood Dagger in the other hand. You're still going to outperform that by simply using this weapon skill. And the upside to that as well is that it does have some range, right? Even though the range of Reduvia Bloodblade is not that great, it's still good enough that you can start by attacking at range. You can stay just outside an enemy's reach and begin triggering hemorrhage on them in a lot of cases. Or if an enemy tends to hop around a lot or something like that, or they have a weird shaped body, then you're going to be able to connect with them even though the dagger has a short reach itself with that projectile. And even though the projectile doesn't have a ton of damage for an Ash of War weapon skill, it still deals enough damage and attacks quickly enough to help you out in a pinch, keep the pressure on enemies. And you might be thinking, well, that's a great build, but, what about bleed immune enemies? And this build actually performs decently against bleed immune enemies. In the video footage here, you'll see that I fought 3 of them. I have Crucible Knight, I have Blackblade Kindred, and I have Putrid Avatar. All 3 of these enemies are bleed immune, and even though they take a little bit longer to kill, as you might expect, they are not that difficult. And there are a few reasons for that. As you're seeing me fight the Crucible Knight, you'll notice that I pulled out a shield, and I put Parry and Retaliation on it to make parrying easier. And I simply parried him and critically striked him with my dagger using the Dagger Talisman. Critical strike on Reduvia is 110, so it's not bad for a dagger. It's not the greatest by any means, but it allows you to swap to a shield when you want and swap back in order to parry enemies and do critical attacks. That is a valid strategy with this build when you need to as well, and you can just simply toggle it on and off on your left hand when you don't need it. And during the Blackblade Kindred boss fight, you'll notice that even though I'm not triggering blood loss with Reduvia Bloodblade, I'm still able to connect with his odd-shaped body where a lot of short-range weapons have problems, and as he's hopping around, hopping backward, etc., I'm able to hit him with the projectile for physical damage, which is a decent damage type against them. So I'm still able to deal with this boss relatively easily, even though it takes me a little bit longer than some of the other bosses that you're seeing. And Putrid Avatar, same thing. Even though you're not triggering blood loss on him when I'm fighting him, because I'm still hitting with the projectile and the weapon simultaneously while I'm point blank, I'm able to deal some decent damage and deal with him effectively. So the armor that you want to use for this build isn't super important. I kind of went with some like roguish looking armor in order to kind of, give me like a rogue feel. I feel like if you're playing with a dagger, you should be fast. You can make this a lightweight build if you want in order to, be able to roll further, etc. That's not a bad idea. I kind of considered doing that. And you need a considerable amount of stamina with this build, so endurance is a good stat, which makes it easier to hit light equip load if that's something that you're aiming for. But you can basically use whatever you want here. Obviously, having 51 poise is ideal because you are going to trade when you're spamming Reduvia Bloodblade, and you don't want to be interrupted because when you trigger a hemorrhage proc, it typically, like staggers the enemy for just a brief second, allowing you to get more attacks off. And if you can do that quick enough, you can usually just keep staggering an enemy or boss, and they go down real fast. The setup that I have here is not 51 poise, but I am using the Bull Goat's Talisman in order to get to that 51 poise exactly. This isn't min-maxed, obviously. It's prioritizing fashion over, protection and poise. But I really like being able to do that, and the Bull Goat's Talisman is absolutely one of my favorite talismans because it lets you hit that breakpoint and still wear, whatever armor you essentially want. But if you were min-maxing, you would obviously make sure natively that you had some armor that was 51 poise, and you could replace this with some other talisman, like the Dagger Talisman or something like that. I also have Shard of Alexander here, or if you're playing at the beginning of the game, Warrior Jar Shard is good. This will improve the damage of the projectile. Again, it's modest damage that this weapon skill does, but any damage you get out of it is good, and you're going to be spamming this when you're point blank. You might as well have this one. I also have Millicent's Prothesis here for extra dexterity. This weapon has decent dexterity scaling, even though it prioritizes Arcane for bleed buildup. And this just gives me that extra dexterity for damage, plus it gives you more damage if you hit rapidly, which you typically do when you're point blank, or even if you're using like R1 attacks, which attack very quickly as well. And then I have Lord of Blood's Exaltation to further increase my attack power when I trigger hemorrhage. This happens all the time. You won't get this one until very far into the game, though. This is not going to be something you're using early on, but there are a lot of other good alternatives. As like I mentioned, you can use the Dagger Talisman to increase your critical damage. You can use something like the Green Turtle Talisman to give you better stamina recovery. You'll notice that when you're spamming Reduvia Bloodblade, you run out of stamina really quickly, so being able to regenerate it and continue is good to have. And again, that's another reason why you need a lot of stamina in this build, because you tend to just spam it. Attribute-wise for this build, I have 50 Vigor, 22 Mind, 30 Endurance, 8 Strength, 25 Dexterity, 16 Intelligence, 7 Faith, 80 Arcane. You don't need any Intelligence or Faith for this build. If you want to go the Dragon Communion route, you'll probably want to take Faith up to like 20 or 25 in order to use Golden Vial, Flame Grammy Strength, and any spells that kind of fall in that range. And also, still require some Arcane or something like that. That is not a bad way to play this build. You will have less blood loss buildup if you take points out of Arcane and put them into Faith. But as you go higher, like in New Game Plus, obviously, you could just start increasing Faith and start picking up spells, and that would be great. Unless you decide to go the spellcasting route here, Mind isn't super important. Reduvia Bloodblade only costs 6 FP per use, and when you chain it, it's still 6 FP. So you're not really going through a lot of FP with this build, so you really don't need very high Mind in order to pull off this build. Strength-wise, we just have the minimum requirements for the weapon. Dexterity can be higher. You'll probably crank this in New Game Plus, unless you are going the Faith route, which I mentioned before. But you'll get more damage out of the weapon if you continue with Dexterity. As I mentioned earlier, we're prioritizing Arcane for blood loss buildup, but Dexterity does about comparable damage, so you will eventually put points into Dexterity in order to get more damage out of the weapon. When it comes to the Flask of Wondrous Physique for this build, you're either going to go probably like more stamina in order to not run out of stamina as quickly when you're spamming Reduvia Bloodblade, or maybe stamina recovery in case, when you do run out of stamina, or maybe you have to like roll out of the way and then your stamina comes back quickly and you can go back into spamming away with it. Those aren't bad. You can get extra dexterity for more damage if you want, or you can get the one that increases your damage as you strike rapidly. That will give you a little bit more damage as well. All those are pretty good for this build. And when it comes to Great Rune for this build, I think Radahn's is probably the best one for this, unless you're going to use Millennia's like later on in the game in order to get health back while you're spamming. But Radahn's gives you HP, gives you FP, and it gives you stamina. More stamina is good for this build. This is a very stamina-hungry build. One of the reasons I have 30 endurance is in order to have enough stamina to just keep spamming this. And even then, you could probably take this up to 35 or 40 easily, and you would probably be able to play better. So Radahn's giving you that extra stamina is really good. That extra HP to trade attacks and not die is good. And, FP is good as well, because we're not, like, cranking mine. So that's definitely how I would go there. So that wraps up my Red Rogue build. You can see this is not a stance break focused build like some of the other ones I've done. This is pure hemorrhage focused. I think this will do rather well in the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC simply because, you know, the hemorrhage damage is based off the max HP of the enemy. So the more HP they have, the more effective hemorrhage is against them, assuming they can be bled. And I think, you know, regardless of whatever attack power nerfs there are in the DLC area, which we don't quite understand how they work exactly yet, then this should still do rather well because it's not so much focused on damage as it is on triggering hemorrhage. As always, if you have further questions about this weapon or this build, please leave them in the comments. And if you have other tips, things maybe I forgot to mention to people, you can leave them there as well. Stay tuned for more Elden Ring content. I will do another daggers build, which I mentioned at the beginning of the video. The Glintstone Chris, really love that weapon as well. And we're going to continue on wrapping up our weapon videos before the DLC and probably doing some more builds as well.